opportunities to do it other than when I come here, so it's definitely a blessing. It's also a blessing to be here. I have told some of you I've been doing some pulpit supply at different churches, and it's always kind of weird to go into a church you've never been to before and preach, and sometimes you don't really know the people, like the crowd, you don't know the sense of what kind of message they need to hear, and also sometimes you don't know the order of the service and then you messed up. But hopefully I can remember every part of this service because I was very much used to it when I was the student minister here, and it's just really a joy to be back with you guys today. Will you pray with me? Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Most of you know that last year, after I finished my field placement here in my second year in my Master of Divinity program, I went to do a full-time internship at Chapman University, which is a college affiliated with the Disciples and the United Church of Christ in Southern California. And while I was there, I worked with students in a number of capacities, but one of the things that I did was I worked with students, the Disciples on campus students, as they prepared their weekly worship service, and they picked a theme for each month to because they would have different speakers each week. And so one of the months we talked about images of God, that we did this during Lent, and we lifted up a lot of different scriptures that really reflected how we see God and how God is portrayed in different ways in the Bible. And the Psalms are a really great way, I think. The Psalms depict God with so much beautiful imagery and different types of words. And I know that in your Feed the Body and Soul, you've been reading through, or praying through the Psalms. So that is one place that we see that. But we also see that in Isaiah and some of the prophetic texts. We talked about this particular scripture, Isaiah 40:21 through 31, and looked at the different images of God there. So I thought that I would kind of capture that message and bring it to you in the midst of looking at different ways of connecting with God through prayer. Isaiah depicts a God who painted the heavens, who created each star in the sky. And although the stars are numerous, God knows them each by name. Isaiah's God is all-powerful against the human rulers, yet also empowers the weak and the weary. As a child, I loved to gaze at the stars. Maybe some of you did as well. And one year for Christmas, I really wanted a telescope, and my dad and I read through the different science magazines trying to figure out what was the right telescope. So I got this telescope for Christmas, and it was a very immature telescope, but I knew when all the meteor showers were expected, and I would get up in the wee hours of the morning and try to catch a glimpse. And I also loved going out to my grandma's farm in rural Oklahoma, where the stars were brightest, where about 3 or 4 in the morning you could catch a glimpse of the Milky Way. As I stared at the stars, I would wonder, are there planets revolving around all those stars? Are there people looking at the stars like I was and wondering the same thing? Did God create it all? And then where did I fit into all that? As many of you know, I was a very peculiar child who had lots of questions. And later in college, I had the opportunity to take an astronomy course, 2 astronomy courses. And just like when I was a kid, I found myself again staring in awe of the heavens. Many times I bundled up and headed out to the observatory at 3 a.m., which was in the mountains. So I was in Virginia for college, and so up in the mountains was even cooler. And we would go to the observatory, and we could see, this was just an amazing telescope, and you could see the nebulas where stars are born, and We could also see the rings of Saturn and the moons of Jupiter pretty clearly. And I loved this class, but sometimes that information could be really overwhelming and really daunting. And once, during a particularly mind-boggling class lesson about the nature of the universe, my professor paused in the middle of his lecture and looked at us to say, sometimes students can get overwhelmed when learning about the vastness of the universe and start to think that they don't matter. Don't ever think that your life is not important or significant in any way. And although written several thousand years earlier, the author of Isaiah seems to be delivering a similar message. He compels us to see the magnificent creation around us, the mighty deeds God has accomplished. Lift up your eyes to the heavens. Who created all of these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. The ancient Israelites that Isaiah is speaking to are a nation in exile in Babylon. And at this point, they have been in captivity for nearly 50 years. Their temple in Jerusalem, the place where they could come close to God, was destroyed. They certainly felt unimportant, overwhelmed by the world around them, forgotten. Unlike the other peoples they came into contact with, they who worshiped gods in different forms of idols and icons, they had nothing to bring with them to remind them daily of God, whom they called Yahweh. All they had was the faith in their hearts and the memory of what all Yahweh had done for them. And I don't know about y'all, but I know that Israel has forgotten many times what Yahweh has done for them. For instance, when they were in the wilderness, after God, through Moses and Aaron, had freed them from slavery in Egypt, they started to complain about being better off in slavery, about the food being better, or the time when Moses then went up the mountain where he spent a long time talking to God and received the law. Some of the Israelites decided to build a golden calf so that they could have a God that was more tangible. So Israel seemed to have really horrible memory recall. So here they are in the middle of what has been a very awful time. The temple is destroyed, and they seem to be in despair. So Isaiah says, have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? He is being a little sarcastic, and these questions are pretty rhetorical, a way to jog their memory. But it takes the Israelites and us back to the very beginning, to Genesis, where we are told that God created the heaven and the earth. Isaiah reminds them of Yahweh's power and might. And the Israelites, despairing in their exile, find themselves crying out, who, why, when, and most importantly, how long? They can't remember the history of God's faithfulness to them over hundreds and thousands of years because they are so focused on their current exile, their current problem of the moment. They are concerned with the Babylonian Empire, but God reminds them that human kings and politicians are nothing compared to God, just a blip on the timeline. Because that is the vastness of God. My first year at Divinity School, I had to read this series of books. It was like this 4-part, 3-volume French philosopher named Paul Ricoeur. It was really hard and really awful. But there was one thing I remember from it that I think I'll probably take with me for the rest of my life. And I think it was just because the TA had to really dumb this down. But the imagery that he used relationship to God. So we as humans experience time like we experience a song. One note following another, following another. But God experiences music by hearing all the notes at once, the entire song at once, hearing each note as if in succession, but at the same time. This is the type of God that Isaiah is trying to remind the people that they have. A God that hasn't forsaken them, who is greater than any enemy, and will ultimately deliver them from the exile, if they can just wait and have faith and remember. As much as I love the imagery of God that Isaiah weaves, I think his choice of depicting humans as grasshoppers is interesting as well. So farming communities dread grasshoppers because they devour everything. In bad seasons, your entire crop could be ruined by a plague of grasshoppers. They can jump long distances, and they can actually also fly, but they don't soar through the air in the sense of a bird. They are mostly pretty focused on what's immediately in front of them. When they're ravaging the entire food source of a community, for example, it doesn't occur to them to stop. They just eat their way through. Perhaps humans, like grasshoppers, are most focused on what's right in front of us at the time. The Israelites find themselves doubting God's presence because all they can see is captivity, and all they have seen in their past is captivity. They want to question God's plan for them and challenge that if God could only see their pain, God would fix it. But Isaiah reminds Israel that God is all-knowing and all-seeing, yet they are not. So they should stop questioning God. God has not forsaken them and has seen their story told to its end and from its beginning, all at the same time. And in the way that God hears those notes all at once, in music you have major and minor chords, you have times of dissonance, and God hears those all at the same time. Just like God hears their pain in Babylon, God hears their pain and their celebration, everything at the same time. God has not forsaken them. And at the end of the scripture, we're reminded that God gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. So for the Israelites in their immediate context, this is the hope of exile, escape from exile that they have been waiting for. A reminder of God's promise to them and God's covenant with their forebears. People like David and Moses who were both flawed and weak. But what does that mean for us today? And as our knowledge of the universe and stars and galaxies is rapidly expanding, I personally find it comforting to imagine a God who set all of that in motion, no matter how God actually did it. But closer to home, in our current exile, we are living in the midst of a world inflicted with poverty and racism, systemic poverty and racism, sexism, violence, religious intolerance, in our own country and in countries around the world, sometimes even in our own communities. And it is so tempting to question God, to cry out, who, how, why, how long? With so many problems, it is so tempting to remain focused on just what's in front of us, our own lives, our families, our immediate communities, to be like the grasshopper. But Isaiah reminds us that with God, we can be empowered for so much more. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles, and they shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint. With God, we can be more than the grasshopper. We can be like soaring eagles who for just a moment barely catch a glimpse of the larger picture. But we can also help to empower others to do the same. Because as we saw time again for the community of Israel, when communities come together around God, God can empower communities to do great things. For the glory of God, for the ultimate message of God's love and hope and peace for the world. So that when the moments when God hears the pain, God also sees the hope and the people working together to bring